By the middle of 1940, Britain stood alone against Germany, Italy, and their allies. The Axis powers had conquered almost all of continental Europe, leaving the United Kingdom as the last stronghold of freedom in the region. Yet despite the gravity of the situation, Britain had its own strategy for defeating Germany, even if it had to fight alone. As long as France remained in the war, Britain's plan was remarkably straightforward. In many ways, it echoed the strategy that had helped the Allies achieve victory during the First World War. The English Channel served as a natural barrier against any land invasion, while the powerful Royal Navy made a large-scale amphibious assault virtually impossible. At the same time, by aggressively patrolling and mining the North Sea, from the Orkney and Scottish Islands all the way to Norway, Britain intended to cut off Germany's overseas supply routes. This strategy would effectively tighten the blockade of German ports, secure Britain's own maritime trade routes, and buy valuable time to build up British military strength before launching a major deployment to France. By playing a largely indirect role in the land war, Britain hoped to gain enough time to create a modern army comparable in size, at least, to that of Italy. The reason was simple. During the 1920s and 1930s, severe budget cuts had drastically reduced military spending, and the size of the British Army had been significantly downsized. People still remembered the horrors of the Great War and the devastating losses Britain had suffered. The British public had no desire to send another generation of soldiers into the trenches. As a result, alongside the policy of appeasing Germany, Britain also chose to reform its army. The goal was to build a force that relied on tanks, artillery, and firepower rather than masses of infantry fighting in trenches. Everything produced by British industry reflected that philosophy. Mobility and firepower were prioritized while minimizing the need for manpower. After the outbreak of war, Britain immediately began expanding its armed forces as planned. The envisioned army of roughly 60 to 70 divisions would require enormous amounts of equipment, training, and logistical support. Building such a force would take considerable time. Until then, the regular forces of the British Empire, together with their French allies, would have to hold the line while the larger army was assembled. The expectation was that this powerful new army would arrive once French and German manpower had been exhausted, allowing Britain to secure victory while emerging from the war in a position to shape the post-war world. But the fall of France changed everything. Instead of the French army bearing the brunt of the German war machine, Britain suddenly found itself facing the full strength of Nazi Germany alone. Operating from Atlantic and Mediterranean ports, German U-boats could now attack British shipping across far larger areas of the ocean. Meanwhile, British cities became prime targets for the Luftwaffe. Britain had no choice but to completely rethink its strategy. Otherwise, the large army it had planned to build would end up fighting on British soil. That was something the British were determined to avoid. As a result, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy received the lion's share of Britain's available manpower, since they represented the country's best chance of survival while continuing to strike back at Germany. Both the Royal Navy and the merchant fleet demanded enormous resources. The Navy needed ships and crews to hunt German submarines, while the merchant marine required enough vessels to keep essential supplies flowing despite inevitable losses to U-boat attacks. The battered British Army evacuated from Dunkirk would become the core of a much smaller force, only 35 divisions instead of the originally planned 60. This shortfall was partially offset by producing enough weapons and equipment to fully equip a total of 55 divisions, while also supplying arms and material to resistance movements across occupied Europe. At first glance, the relatively small number of field divisions was further compensated by Britain's heavy emphasis on tanks and motorized transport. In the end, Britain fielded one armored division for every 2.5 infantry divisions. For comparison, the United States maintained a ratio of roughly one armored division for every 3.5 infantry divisions, while Germany had only one armored division for every 8.5 infantry divisions. British infantry divisions were also unusually large and fully motorized. A typical British division consisted of around 18,000 troops supported by 4,000 trucks. By comparison, a German infantry division usually had 12,000 to 15,000 soldiers and only about 700 trucks. Most of its supplies were still transported by slow horse-drawn wagons. Simply put, Britain focused on maintaining a smaller but highly trained and highly mobile army capable of overcoming an enemy with superior numbers. The emphasis was on quality rather than quantity. Britain's overall strategy was therefore long-term and indirect from the very beginning. Resistance movements, combined with rapid amphibious raids and airborne operations, would force German troops to disperse across occupied Europe to suppress uprisings. This would wear down enemy forces while maintaining Allied morale and improving coordination between resistance groups and Allied military operations. Over the course of years, Germany would gradually be weakened by the naval blockade, strategic bombing, and constant partisan warfare. Only after the enemy had been sufficiently exhausted would the well-trained and fully equipped forces of the British Empire launch a massive invasion and deliver the decisive blow. In 1940, this final offensive was tentatively expected to take place in 1942 or 1943. However, Japan's entry into the war, and several other major developments, made that timetable hopelessly optimistic. Later, no specific date for such an invasion was set. The entry of the Soviet Union and the United States into the war fundamentally changed Allied planning, shifting attention toward determining when and where a large-scale invasion of continental Europe should take place. It's also worth remembering that before June 1941, a war between Germany and the Soviet Union appeared highly unlikely. Likewise, although British leaders desperately hoped the United States would eventually enter the war, they could not build their entire strategy around an event that remained uncertain. In conclusion, Britain's grand strategy sought to balance survival with ultimate victory. Its revised approach can best be described as a modernized version of Britain's strategy during the Napoleonic Wars. By waging economic warfare at sea against a continental enemy while supporting resistance movements throughout occupied Europe, Britain hoped to disperse, exhaust, and demoralize Germany's superior military forces. At the same time, Britain would preserve and steadily build its own strength until the enemy had been weakened enough for its comparatively small, but exceptionally well-trained, army to deliver the decisive knockout blow. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and support the channel for more history content.